Okay, given that we are in the United States, and in the United States as well as many westernized countries, we are very punctual people. So when we say 7:02 we begin, that's what we will do. The culture that I came from, it's quite a different story when it comes to time. We could say that I'll be there tomorrow, and it could be the next day or the following week. So again, welcome to Book Bites. This is Pao Lor. Tonight we are going to cover Modern Jungles, a memoir that I recently wrote. It was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. First and foremost, I am very grateful for the press for taking on this particular project. So we'll cover a little bit about the book. The book covers about 14 years from the 1970s, I would say from the mid 1970s to the mid 1980s. So, it's been, you could say that I believe the first Hmong American arrived in the United States in 1975. So you're talking about, over 40, 45, 46 years since the first Hmong arrived in the United States. And so, a lot of these first Hmong Americans came because they had a direct connection to the United States during the Secret War. So they came to the United States under a different classification. Basically, because of that connection, they were allowed to relocate to the United States. And then, of course, after that, there's a mass exodus. There's a lot of information out there about, let's say, the Hmong American diaspora for the last 40 plus years. However, when you look at the resources that are available, there's good research out there. There are good documentaries out there. But when it comes to, let's say, books, aside from a few books that are out there, there are very few books that chronicle or items that are written by individuals who went through that experience. From when when the Hmong were leaving Laos to resettling in refugee camps in Thailand, and then of course eventually relocating to different countries around the world. There's a saying that back, let's say prior to 1975, there's an old saying that the sun only shines on the Hmong for like half a day. And basically what that saying was that, before 1975, the majority of the Hmong basically lived in China or Southeast Asia. And then 45 years later, the Hmong have been dispersed around the world. So today's saying is that today the sun shines on the Hmong 24 hours a day. So in a historical context, a lot has transpired since then, and this is a part of that experience. So I'm going to share just a part of the story with you. Oftentimes this is the part that when you talk about the Hmong American experience, especially the early part, that almost everyone in the United States has a connection to this part of the Hmong American diaspora. And you can say that this part involves two, let's say just two countries. One of the countries is Laos, and then the other one is obviously Thailand. So when you look at the Hmong American diaspora, there's a tie to this country. where everyone has a tie to that key historical era. So let me just take you to probably around 1977. So around 1977, this is 2 years after the United States had left Southeast Asia. And so basically anyone who sided with the United States became, you could say, targets of ethnic persecution by the regime in power at the time. And so, we were one of those families who, families that stayed or decided to stay behind. We didn't initially leave with some of the people who left pretty early. And so in 1977, we were living in a village. But by this time I had lived, because we were constantly moving. So I have been living in multiple villages before that. And in my understanding of the world at this time was basically just village life. You could say, just the sky above, and then anything else that you could see. And so anything else beyond, anything else beyond that, I had no idea. So basically, my world was very small, very microscopic when you look at it from a global perspective. And so we were living in this village, and our goal at that time was to just stay there. We were waiting for the war to be over, and for things to get back to normal. And then my father and family, we were just hoping that we can go back to the way that life was, which was, you live in your village, you do a little farming. If you're fortunate, you exchange goods and businesses with other surrounding villages. And so we lived there. And then I was probably around 5 at the time. And one night or one late evening, my father had gone on a business trip and came home. And what he usually does is that he would go around the villagers and share the goods, particularly salt at that time. We were so isolated from the world that we were starving for salt. And so my dad would go around and give people salt, other spices, rice, just the basic necessity. Anyway, on that particular night, it was late. I learned much later in my life that my father had been warned about the possibility of him being assassinated because of what he was doing. Going outside of the village, going to other villages and gathering resources for the people in our village. So there's some people, you could say some leaders in that region that were not very happy with what my father was doing. And so that particular evening, would changed basically my entire life. So after distributing all the goods, he came back to our hut. And so on that night, I believe it's like July. I learned this much later on. There's actually a document that exists. I did not mention a lot of these in the book. A lot of these, a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you in the book, perhaps in a different book, I will. Because in the book, I was just trying to tell the readers memories that I had. And so there's actually a document that was signed by witnesses of what transpired that evening. So on that night, my father was assassinated, and then basically that changed our family's entire life, entire future, and what would you could say um, the spark that left us, or the spark that basically got us on a journey that would lead me to where I am today. And so just that little story there, in the book, they're just a small, you could say, maybe 2 or 3 pages um, dedicated to that particular event. But there's a lot of complexity, a lot of behind the scene of what caused that event to happen. But basically, when you read the book, that's kind of a defining one of many, many defining moments. So after the assassination, our family decided that we would leave, that we were no longer safe living in Laos. And so probably like a week, maybe a week or 2 weeks at most, after my father's assassination, that we would embark on this journey that for me at the time, just seemed like it was going forever. Like they're just um, uh, it's one event after another. And as a child, you can kind of pretend or imagine what it's like to be 5 years old, and um, your life is really, on a positive side, I guess you could say that it's like a mystery. You have no idea of what's going on. You really have no clue as to why are you moving, or why are you doing all these things. Why is your family keep moving on, and like what is the ultimate um, destination or purpose. So we we just kept moving and moving. That's kind of one of the themes of the journey out of Laos for many Hmong Americans. So I'm going to take a little break here. We have a question from Shelley in Spring Green. Shelley asks, did your parents fight in the war, or were they trying to hurt villagers too, and not just soldiers? Um, I'll answer the first part about did my parents fight in the war. My father was a soldier for a few years. He was a soldier for about 3 years, from when he was 14 to when he was 17. And this is a great question, simply because when we think of war, when we think about the Hmong American experience, we I hope that people do realize that it's very complex. That there's a lot of stories that get told, but not necessarily to, let's say, mainstream audience. So this question really poses at the life of being a soldier, particularly very young, being 12, 13, 14, and you have to fight for your country. So about 3 years, my father was a soldier, and he left, and then decided that he wanted to raise a family. And it's just like in let's say in The Patriot with Mel Gibson, or in A Gladiator with Russell Crowe, where my father just wanted to go home and raise a family, and trying to live a peaceful life among a very, you could say, a country or a region of the world that was in turmoil. And so, and then once when you grow up in a war where there are two sides or three sides, and you're really just a pawn in the big scheme of things. And so you could say we did not, let's say, directly uh, fought in the war, but we have indirect connection to the war as to who we sided with, and you could never be sure of who, which side people were on. But your brothers and sisters, it's almost like the Civil War here in the United States, where you have brothers taking different sides, different stands, different positions, uh, and so there's always that sense of who do you trust, who do you believe, and so all of these variables were in play. So anytime there's a civil war, it's a war that happened a long time ago, but many of the variables are common when it comes to civil wars around the world. So the Hmong American experience is no different, and that's really one of the reasons for the book. Here's another one question. Let's see, she was in 6th grade, and I think she means we were the, yes. Yeah, when you're a kid, that's a great point. When you're a kid growing up in a war, the war is pretty, you could say, pretty black and white. It's either we were the bad guys or we were the good guys. So it's almost like when you're on your side, I'm just thinking if I were on the other side, they were thinking, especially going back to my point about families. So we have family members who were on the other side, and they thought we were the bad guys, and then we thought they were the bad guys. So it's that concept of good versus evil. It's one or the other. And given that back then information did not get, it was very difficult to get information. And so by the time information gets to you, it could have been a month old, a year old, or even longer. And so, you're making decisions not so much on, let's say, current information, but rather outdated information. You try as much as you can to get current information. For example, when we were near the river and we were trying to cross the river, we had scouts that would go ahead and trying to find the safest passage to get to the river. So in that context, the information that we got was very current. It's basically just someone going out there for 2 or 3 days, sometimes a week, depending on what they encounter on that particular expedition. And then they would come back and just share with us that, okay, this is the safest route to go, and when to go, and how we should go about navigating certain geographical area. The route that we took, there were many villages, small villages, and you weren't sure as to whether or not they were friendly villagers or if they were on the other side. So in fact, when you cross those regions or you cross areas where there were villages, you try to cross at night, and you try to avoid being seen by the villagers, because you weren't sure which side they were on. They could report to the authority that they saw you, and they could tell the authorities where you were heading, and then they could come and they could come after you. And so, families were very cautious. Now we were, we were one of the, you could say there are many groups throughout Laos that cross to Thailand. And so I'm going to share with you briefly just where everybody, where everybody, some of the groups came from. So let's say that my family and many of the people from my region were mainly from the Sengkuang province, which is a province that borders the Vientiane province. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the geography of Laos, but we were mainly from that region. It's about maybe 20 or 30 miles southeast of Phun Savan. And then, there are people who are living in the city, like my wife. They lived, at that time, they lived north of Vientiane, which is the capital of Laos. So, sometimes my wife and I joked around about where I lived and where she lived. So she was more of a city person, whereas I was more of, this kid from way out there in the boonies, really, in the jungles. And so for her, for individuals like her, their journey across Laos, or their journey to Thailand is completely different than mine. There's also people from north of where she lives, or she lived at the time, near Vang Vian, more towards La Paban, where they actually took the northern route to cross to Thailand. And so, they did not encounter many of the hardships and tragedies that, let's say, people in my region did. People that decided to take the southern route, which is the route that goes through about maybe 40 miles south of Vientiane, where we would cross the Mekong River to Thailand. So the majority of us are in, that region, from that region. It's basically a stretch there's a stretch that's about, now this is information that I gathered much later on. There's a stretch of about, I would say, maybe 45 to 60 miles where, my family lived at that time. And so all these individuals that live within that stretch of 45 to 60 miles, all, you could say, all had association with the United States, as well as General Vang Pao, who was the leader of the Hmong resistance at that point. And the Hmong resistance was basically supported by the United States. So the majority of us came from that region. It's only recently that region was opened to, let's say, to the public, where, let's say, today, without the COVID restrictions, that today I could go to some of that region, the region where many of Hmong Americans like myself came from, that we could actually go back and visit, some of the areas that I cover in the book. Where we cross, and some of those early days in refugee camps, it's quite, even after I arrived, even after my family arrived in the United States, even though we have not arrived for that long, I can tell you that resettling in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where we grew up, seemed at that time so far away. It was almost like a world that when you start looking at the cities here in the United States, the life here in the United States, the resources that you have in the United States back in the 80s, and you compare that to the resources that we had, it was most surreal, strange, that the two worlds just seem so far apart and so um, so extreme. And that's just one of the themes um, of the book. Two vastly extreme worlds, and so how do you navigate one to the other? So basically, those are just some of the brief snapshots and historical information about the book that I hope that will help will help readers to have a better understanding of some of the things that I talk about or some of the nuances that are in the book.